right, so number 2 is going to code out to C83.76. Are you okay there? Number 4, C91.41. And number 6, C81.90. Alright. On the next page, it's talking about the 2 different types of neoplasms. Remember how they break them out into solid neoplasms and then into lymphatic or hematopoietic neoplasms. So the first group codes out to C00 through C80. Those are the solid neoplasms. Those are going to have a single localized point of origin. They're going to start in one spot. And of course they can invade or they can metastasize to different sites. So with the solid kind, you can have primary and secondary sites. Okay. Whereas with the hematopoietic and lymphatic, they can arise in a single site or they can arise simultaneously in several sites. Okay? And basically, they're just floating, they're circulating through the lymph system and or through the blood. And so they don't classify those as primary and secondary sites. So if the tumor originates in the lymph system or in the blood, then everything is primary. Okay. The exception, which of course there always is one, is if you have a solid tumor that spreads to the lymph nodes. You'll see that a lot with breast, and it spreads to the axillary lymph nodes. Okay, then the lymph nodes would be secondary. The primary would be the breast, the lymph nodes would be secondary. So, but that's different because it started in the solid tumors and spread to the lymph. If it originates in the lymph or the blood, then it's all primary. Okay. So they talk about each one of these separately. The first ones they talk about are the solid. We've already talked about how it can be invasive, which is more of that spread to the adjacent tissue, or an invasion, direct extension, whatever you want to call it, versus metastases, which generally is thought to be to a distant site. Okay. And remember, metastatic always requires the 2 codes. Okay. And we talk about that a lot, and they talk about metastatic in this section a lot, but you can also have a single primary site. So don't just think, oh, they've got carcinoma of the breast, I better put on an unknown secondary or whatever. So you can have a single site. But with solid tumors, it can also spread. So whenever you see metastatic or primary and secondary, you know you have a minimum of 2 codes. Again, those codes could either be a current cancer code, it could be a history of, or it could be that unknown site. At the bottom of the page, it's talking about when you have cancers that cover, or a neoplasm that covers overlapping sites. You might also hear it referred to as contiguous sites. And so basically what they're saying is we can't really determine that single point of origin. And so in that scenario, they want you to code it to a 0.8. Several of the codes have a 0.8 for overlapping sites or contiguous sites. However, you could have 2 single sites of origin in the same organ. So like you could have 2 lesions in the breast, okay? And if they're in separate codable, is that a word, codable? Classifiable numbers, you would assign both. So you might be able to show you have something in the upper quadrant or the lower quadrant. And so if those are individual, then you would code those. And you would have to try to figure out from the documentation whether you got 2 distinct primary sites or you've got a primary that's spread. You know, so that's going to depend on that physician and how he documents it. Okay, so let's try code number 1 on page 449. This is one of the contiguous sites. So did you get that one? And you're looking in your neoplasm table on page 326. You got your esophagus there. Notice that if it were upper, it would be C15-3. If it were middle, it would be C15-4. But they're saying they can't tell. It's overlapping. They're not sure where it started. So you have to go to that overlapping sites, which is C15.8.
That's the only code you would have, right?
That's the only code you would have. C15.8, overlapping. And I've really already talked about that. The fact that you could have two malignant tumors in the same organ, which are two primaries, versus metastases. So we already talked about that. Any trouble figuring it out, you got to query the physician. You might also hear that referred to as synchronous primary cancers, synchronous occurring together. And then down at the bottom, it's just telling you the term metastatic and metastases are used, of course, interchangeably and sometimes ambiguously. So they give you some guidelines for determining what is meant. And these ought to sound familiar to you. Okay, so on page 450, you couldn't remember these. Metastatic 2. Whatever organ is listed in there, what is it going to be?
Secondary.
Secondary, right? Because it's coming from somewhere going to somewhere. So you would have your code for your secondary site plus an unknown primary, right? In that scenario. Then you got metastatic from. And that's going to be whatever body site is there. Primary. Plus an unknown secondary. And then the next option is when you have metastatic of, and it could be, 1, 2, 3 different sites. Okay, so it's multiple sites. Who can remember that one?
Secondary.
Secondary. Every single one of these will be secondary. Okay, and you'll have an unknown primary.